in the back. The third from the back. It's the same map that you have on the board, on the projector. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God. Amen. We are starting a series on St. Paul letters from the New Testament. And today we're into the introduction. The first part of the introduction is the life. And the life and the places that St. Paul went to in his life history. The second part, we will be focused more on the places, the churches where the letters and the people that the letters sent to. And the third part will be an introduction to the Philippians, the letter to the Philippians. So let's start with the life of St. Paul. If you have that map in the handout, the life of St. Paul actually started in a little town in Asia Minor, which is now Turkey, at Tarsus. So you have a little box there that talks about the early life of St. Paul and his conversion. He was born in Tarsus. He's a Jew and also a Roman citizen. So you're an Egyptian, but U.S. citizen. Because your ethnic background is Egyptian, but your citizenship is American. So same for St. Paul. He was a Jew, but born in a Roman province. So he's a Jew and Roman. He studied under a Jewish scholar, very famous one. Actually, there's few names. There may be 3 Gamaliels in the history of the Jews. This one that St. Paul learned under is the most famous. Gamaliel the first, most famous of all the Gamaliels in the history. And he's a very famous rabbi at Jerusalem. According to his own talk, he is a Pharisee in Galatians. He says, I'm a Pharisee and my father is a Pharisee. What's a Pharisee? A Pharisee is a teacher of the law. Somebody who is very informed and knowledgeable about the Torah, the law of Moses. He persecuted the early Christians at Jerusalem, and that you find that in Acts 8. He persecuted the Christians. And you know that in the story of the martyrdom of St. Stephen, he was very much agreeable, and actually he guarded the garments of those who stoned Stephen to death. He was converted to Christianity through a vision of Christ on the road to Damascus. We'll focus on this today. I want to take this conversion part and talk a little bit about it, because we'll explain some of the characters of St. Paul. So you have those 3 big cities. Tarsus, big names, I mean they're not big cities. Tarsus, Jerusalem, and Damascus, as his early life. When I draw the map of the Mediterranean, just for us to learn how to draw the map, you would go and draw this. I would follow this. Just make it like that. Follow the Mediterranein. And then you go up for the Aegean Sea. And if the board extends a little bit, I would draw the Black Sea. But this is where I would put the Mediterranean. I would draw it like that. It's almost like a rectangle on its side, on some longer side. Then I will put 3 cities. One just near the bottom right angle of the rectangle. One at the top. And one in the middle. And they will be the 3 cities where St. Paul grew up and learned and converted. He learned here, and on his way to Damascus, he got the conversion somewhere in that route. So maybe today we should also learn the map of the Mediterranean, or begin to learn it, just to know where things are. And if I bet some of you went on a cruise, they have maybe perhaps visited some of these places, and we're going to keep building it up as we study. That's one of the things we need to study in our work through the letters of St. Paul. So you got Jerusalem, Tarsus, and Damascus. In order of time, it will be Tarsus first, Jerusalem second, Damascus third. Then he stayed, and it's really, most of us don't know this. After his conversion, he went and stayed a little bit in Antioch. So he went into years of preparation after his conversion. Paul worked with the Christians in Damascus. That's Acts 9. And the desert regions of Arabia. Apparently he went down here somewhere. I believe he went and visited the mountain. Most people do that. Believe that he went to visit the mountain where Moses and the Israelites saw God, Mount Horeb. And Jerusalem. And then they started to fight him. The Jews started to recognize that he became a power against them and against their teachings. So he had to go back, driven back to Tarsus. And in Tarsus he spent 10 years. It's very interesting. You think St. Paul was converted, next day he was on the first missionary trip? No. This did not happen. Why? He's still in the primitive stages of his conversion. Just like a child, starting to find out his bearings. He doesn't know exactly what is required of him. Sometimes we have this childish ideas about the life with God, and we think God's going to give us power and zap us with the magic wand and we'll be transformed and we'll do things differently. No, it takes some time. And St. Paul spent a lot of time rereading Moses, trying to understand how does Christ fit into this picture. And I bet you all what he learned in those 9 years, he came back to teach the churches. It's almost like Moses, when he had to be thrown out of Egypt, when Pharaoh wanted to kill him. After he murdered the Egyptian and he was afraid, he had spent 40 years in the desert. St. Paul had the same experience. But he goes back to his hometown and worked like anybody else, mixed among the crowd. Maybe he tried to teach his contemporary Jews in the synagogue. Maybe they listened, maybe not. But this was the beginning of St. Paul. Then Barnabas knew him. And I bet Barnabas always thought, this is a waste of time. Let's go back and get this great missionary. He's meant to work as a missionary. So he went to Tarsus, got him. So this is hometown of Saul, of St. Paul. Where is the hometown of Barnabas? Anybody knows? It is Cyprus. This is Barnabas. So when he goes down to take him and bring him to his first missionary trip, they would go to Antioch, and then they would go from there to Cyprus and to Tarsus, Derbe, Iconium, Lystra, all the way to another Antioch. This is their first missionary trip. Why is that? Another discovery. The first missionary trip is a missionary trip to home. They go to their hometowns. They don't go jump into some places where they don't know. What is the message? That the work of God works in increments, no jumping. You start with the things you're familiar with, and then you go to the things that you're not familiar with. You start with the things you can do, and then God will help you in doing things that you cannot normally do. So this is the second note that we make today. He goes back and prepared for 9 years. The second note is he goes into Cyprus and Tarsus, and then you notice here there's two Antioch. There's an Antioch here, and there's an Antioch here. They call this Antioch Syria. This one is Antioch Pisidia. And this is in Turkey, this is in Syria. This Antioch is where the disciples of Christ are for the first time called Christians. The Syrians are very proud of that. The church, the Antiochian church, are very proud to call them or their place the place where the Christians are first called Christians. Antioch today is two churches. It's one church, but the Antioch is the Syrian Orthodox and then the Antiochian church. And these are Oriental Orthodox and these are Eastern Orthodox over the Council of Chalcedon. This one has a strong relationship with the Coptic Church. This one has a strong relationship with the Greek Orthodox Church. They are not exactly the same church, but they were once the same church. This is the first trip. When St. Paul finished this one with Barnabas, they go back, and then he goes on the second missionary trip. On the second missionary tour, carried the gospel further west, and then they went through what we call Macedonia. Macedonia is proper, Greek proper. That's Greece. And then you would have Thessalonica, Philippi, Berea, and then even Corinth and Athens. On the third missionary tour, he goes to Ephesus, Troas, and Miletus. He's going to go that route. I'm going to leave these details too when we talk a little bit more about the letters. The mission or the trip to Rome is outside these trips because he's not going there on a missionary business. He's going there tied up. And when he was in Jerusalem after the third missionary trip, the Jewish zealots mobbed him and tried to kill him. So he says, I'm a Roman citizen, I cannot be tried before anybody but Caesar himself. So the king and King Agrippa here, Herod Agrippa, said, if you appeal to Caesar you go, I cannot do anything for you. So they take a ship and they go up to Rome, and the ship gets shipwrecked somewhere here, and they continue, but they reach Rome at the end around 62. And then some people say he had 2 imprisonments. I'm going to talk about that shortly. Okay, I'm going to stop here, and then if you have any questions, this would be the end of the very short summary. I'm just trying to get an overall picture before we go into the letters. Any questions about this one?
Where is Istanbul?
Okay, it's Byzantium. You see this little? I cannot. This is the wall. I cannot write here. I'm tilted. Yeah. Yes. Can we?
I already asked.
Yeah.
Okay,
عشان تسجل. So where is Byzantium? Where is Istanbul? مش عشان تسجله هيك. Where is Istanbul? It's Byzantium in that time, and you see this little. We call it the Narus, the Isthmus, between the Aegean Sea and the Black Sea, and that's the Bosphor. So that would be the little spot here. That would be the capital of the Byzantine Empire. This is where Constantine is going to move his capital from Rome to this. Okay. We're going to go back to this map often so we can actually put more stuff on it. But for now, let's start with that, and then we can go back to it over and over again, adding a bit more and more details. So this is, in short, the life of St. Paul. They say between the first and the second trip, he went to Spain. But we'll talk about that shortly. Okay. In our next session, I'm going to review with you the first page, which we had the life of St. Paul. So there's the early life and conversion. He's born in Tarsus, both a Jew and a Roman citizen. Studied under the Jewish scholar Gamaliel at Jerusalem. Persecuted the early Christians at Jerusalem. Converted to Christianity through a vision of Christ on the road to Damascus. And I want to read with you in this session a little bit from that conversion story. It will make a little difference, maybe a big difference also, in the understanding of St. Paul's mission. In Acts chapter 9, in the beginning it reads, Saul kept on threatening to kill the Lord's followers. I'm reading from the Bible we have here, the contemporary English version. I suggest you do the NIV or the New King James. Saul kept on threatening to kill the Lord's follower. He even went to the high priest and asked for letters to the Jewish leaders in Damascus. He did this because he wanted to arrest and take to Jerusalem any man or woman who had accepted the Lord's way. When Saul had almost reached Damascus, a bright light from heaven suddenly flashed around him. He fell to the ground, and he heard a voice, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Who are you, Lord? Saul asked. I am Jesus, the Lord answered. I am the one you are persecuting. Now get up and go to the city where you will be told. That's the verse. The full verse says, why are you persecuting me? For it is hard for you to kick against the goads. Then he asked, who are you? And he said to him to go to Damascus, enter Damascus, and there in a place, he described it to him, you will be told what to do. So he was blind. I want to focus on the verse. It's hard for you to kick against the goads. We know this. I've learned this since I was a child. What does it mean to be told, why are you persecuting me? It's hard for you to kick against the goads. This verse, this saying of Christ, is going to shape the ministry of St. Paul. If you get it, you get almost 90% of what St. Paul is thinking and interested in doing. Okay? What's the goads? In American language would be the spurs of the cowboy. They put on their heels to kick the horse. So because of the way the legs of the horse are shaped, the horse can move his legs or their legs in forward motion or backward motion. But the goads are sideways. So it's impossible for the horse to kick the goads. So either the horse go forward or kick backwards, but never sideways. So who is the horse? And who is the rider that is kicking the horse? And what are the goads? That's a riddle. And St. Paul understood it. And our Lord speaks to him in his own language, in his own way of understanding. It's very sophisticated. Of course, if he's saying to him, it's difficult for you to kick, then the horse is St. Paul. He's kicking. And who is the rider? Where he's saying to him, you're trying to persecute me, you're kicking against the goads, it's me who's kicking you, and you're trying to kick back. So the Lord is the rider. What are the goads? Who is really the one that St. Paul is trying to kick and hurt and push back? and do all kinds of atrocities to them. The Christians. So here is St. Paul, and it's really amazing when you understand what's happening, because this is right in between his eyes. Because he is, instead of being angry with Christ, he's frustrated and pouring all his wrath on the Christians. He understood it plainly. He understood that the Lord is trying to tease him with the Christians. Whenever he sees the Christians flourishing, miracles happening, singing, praising God, he gets very angry. And he says that can be. They're doing more miracles. There's grace in there, much more than we have in our synagogues. What is the best way to deal with this? Let us wipe them out, kill them, force them to stop. He doesn't understand that he's fighting Christ. This is actually what Moses said, and Paul understood it. Moses said, "They tease me." That's God saying to his people, "You are going to tease me by what is not a God. I will tease you by what is not a nation." Do you get what he's saying? He says, you're going to do the things, you're going to worship things that's not God, and you're going to tease me as God. I'm not going to stop. I'm going to actually tease you with people that you never expected to be anything, and make you very, very frustrated and angry. So what St. Paul is doing, and recognized, and he's going to do later, he's recognized the work of God through the teasement, the enticing, the work of negative feelings. God is not doing something encouraging here. He's actually saying to them, okay, you don't want to believe in me, you don't want to believe in the gospel, I'm going to give you something to make you angry. And if you don't think about this, you're going to destroy yourself. So what happens? Because there's a question. There's a big question. In the book of Acts, are we following? Is this clear? In the book of Acts, the whole disciples' atmosphere is for farmers and tax collectors and fishermen, and the high priest and the Pharisees bring them, and they actually shoot them down. They're very uneducated people who has no learning. And then the high priest can mock them, can say anything about them. They're uneducated people. So what they do at the end of their encounters, they whip them, they scourge them, and send them home. Who's going to stand against these learned, sophisticated people? So God brings Saul, who is one of the most clever Pharisees in his time, one of the best disciples of Gamaliel. And St. Paul said that himself in the letters. He says, I was far ahead of my friends. And he makes him to stand against the Pharisees, but not in Judea, which is a very, very interesting. So I expect if I am in God's counsel, I would say, okay, you converted St. Paul, you did a lot of work, now he's ready to go and confront the Pharisees. But instead, where is St. Paul sent? To
the Gentiles.
The Gentiles. He's sent to the Gentiles. Why? Why would you send St. Paul to the Gentiles? St. Paul just discovered it. He says, when I am converting the Gentiles, what am I doing to the Jews?
You're teasing them.
Teasing them to the bones. Because I'm going to go to the Jews, they would not accept it. The gospel is too hard for them. And in the book of Romans, you will not understand the Romans until you understand this concept. Paul says they refused the gospel because God had hardened their heart partially until the Gentiles accepted. But by the acceptance of the Gentiles, they will be teased. They will be thrown into anger. They will have to think about it. They have to face it. One more thing that I think we have to understand. What is the first obstacle to the church in the first church? The first obstacle that the church had to face after the conversion of the Gentiles. The first council. The first problem. Trying to convert the Gentiles into Judaism first before they become Christians. And Peter could not stand. St. Peter actually was rebuked by St. Paul by actually trying to go in that line. Why? Because he has not learned. Even with him being filled with the Holy Spirit, his mind could not stand against the argument of the Pharisees who became Christians. So who was going to stand against them? St. Paul. So St. Paul is going to stand between the Jewish church and the Gentile church and says, you don't need to turn these people into Jews. You can accept Christ without... Nobody else could have done that. Not St. Peter, not St. Andrew, not Barnabas, not Matthew, none of them. Because they could not stand the argument of the Pharisees. Only St. Paul. So once I understood these 2 points about St. Paul, that his conversion story, it's about teasing, because he was teased big time and brought to provoked to anger, and I understand that his learning was meant for the confrontation of the Pharisees. Then I understand his mission. Let us go into the churches and the letters.
Questions of mine?
No, not yet. Let's go into this table. You have it also in your... Okay. How many letters under the name of St. Paul? 14 letters. Just let's start remembering this. This is our memorization part. But actually, just for our own knowledge, most people today don't... Yes. What's good for yourself? This is good. Yeah. ممكن تسأل السؤال بتاعك سوري.
طب ثانية.
لا لا.
So he went to Jerusalem and he was learning the Jewish religion. So what was his title in persecuting the Christians? Was he like volunteering to kill Christians?
He's the one who went to the high priest.
It was.
He went to the high priest and said, give me letters. So when I go to the synagogue in Damascus, they would actually give me the permission to persecute. Because all the first Christians were Jews.
Yeah.
So it is actually from within the synagogue. It's imagining in our church. Some people are converting to something else and teaching. So this would turn anybody who is zealous for the church very angry. So they would go to the bishop and ask, give us letters so we can go and collect these people. And
So
clean the
he's taken
synagogue.
it in his hand
Yes.
to finish them.
Yes.
And the other thing about converting the Gentiles to Jewish. So that means that, because I think there was a repetition about circumcision. So they circumcised all the Gentiles first?
Yes, yes. And not only that, if somebody was circumcised, they do it again. There is a way to do it in the Jewish tradition, even if they get just a little bit of drops of blood. The point is to make them to the Hebrews is a little bit different, because in the letter to the Hebrews, St. Paul didn't write his name. In all the letters, he says, written by so and so from Paul. Paul gives the greetings of peace and grace to the church of the Corinthians, to the church of the Thessalonians, to the church of Colossians. But in the letter to the Hebrews, he doesn't say that. He said there is some characteristics of St. Paul that you would see in all the 13 letters is not found in the Hebrews. That's why in most of the books, even the very traditional, very conservative books, you would have them 13, and the Hebrews would be written separately with a question mark if it is St. Paul or not. Just for us to know when you read books about the commentary on the letters of St. Paul. So you have Romans. I would like to remember them in this. There's singles and there is doubles. Like there's some 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy. There is doubles and there is singles. So how many doubles we have? There's just kind of to make you remember them. You have, there is the 2 Corinthians, 1 and 2 Corinthians, and you have singles until you come to the Thessalonians. There's 1 and 2 Thessalonians. And there's 1 and 2 Timothy. How many there are? 3 times 2 is 6 out of the 13. We said Hebrews we're going to leave. Hebrews is the last one in St. Paul list. So 6 out of the 13 you have 7 left. All what you need to remember is the 7. But actually the 2s are easy. It's 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians. 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians. 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy. Just remember those 6. There are only 3 names, but 1st and 2nd. Remember, the letter to the Romans is the first one, and they call it the Gospel of St. Paul. Why? It is the theology of St. Paul in one letter. When you listen to the stories of saints from the 1st and 2nd century, even to the 3rd century, one of the most famous I know is Saint Helena, the mother of King Constantine. Her conversion was by the letter to the Romans, to become a Christian. She didn't have any of the Gospels. So that is how she got hold of Christ's Gospel, by the letter to the Romans. So the letter to the Romans is very significant. I would say the summation of all St. Paul's theology. Some of it is really difficult. And it has the most difficult passages, which I mean Romans 9, 10, and 11. How many chapters? 16. Okay? The 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, just remember, Corinth is a bad city, known for a very famous activity. They had the temple of Aphrodite, and the temple was served by sexual immorality. So you would expect this letter to address problems related to sexual immorality. Okay, these 2 letters, 1st and 2 Corinthians. So you go from the Gospel of St. Paul, which is Romans 16 chapter, to the letter to the Corinthians 16 and 13. The fourth one, the third name, Galatians, is 6. So Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, 6:4. Galatians is about this exact problem. You're going to see it in all the letters. Galatians specifically, it's the only letter that in one of the translations he called stupid. It's foolish. It's the only letter that he calls them names. You usually don't, St. Paul doesn't say that, do that. Galatians is the church where people started to revert back to Judaism. That's why he goes very aggressively, he gets very mad. In that letter, you would hear him say things, who threw a spell on you, did magic on you, to convert you back to Judaism? Do you want to abandon Christ and go back to the old law? That is Galatians. So again, if I want you to remember just simple things, Romans is the gospel of St. Paul. Corinthians is sexual immorality. Galatians is going back to Judaism. Okay? Ephesians is a symphony about the church. That's where he actually tells you what the church is. It's really a poetry. I love Ephesians. Ephesians and Philippians are my favorites. Ephesians is where he explains the body of Christ. There's images. There's 3 images in Ephesians about the church. He calls the church the body of Christ. He calls the church the building. And he calls the church the spouse. That's why in Ephesians you have to talk about the wife and the husband. You have to talk about the children. You have to talk about being members of the same building, of the same household. Philippians is poetry about joy and unity. And this is the most, that's why we'll start with it. This the lightest, the most joyful, the exciting letter, and the shortest. And the letters to the churches. Then there's Thessalonians and Colossians. Now, when we go past Philippians, you get Colossians. Colossians is theology about who Christ is. He's the firstborn of all creation. He's the image of the invisible Father. It's that big terminology about Christ in the first chapter. So this is where Colossians is. And then in the Nelson map and chart where I get some of the stuff out, he's talking about the cosmic Christ. That Christ is the high priest of all creation. Thessalonians, first and second. So let's go back. First one is Roman, the Gospel of St. Paul. Then the 2 Corinthians. Then the foolish Galatians. Then let's keep it with titles like the Gospel of the Romans, the sexual immorality of the Corinthians, which is 2. And then the foolishness of Galatians. And then the poetry of the church of Ephesians. And then the poetry of joy of Philippians. And then the theology of Christ of Colossians. And then you go into another set of 2s. So you have one set of 2s, 1, 2, 3, 4, another set of 2s. 1 couple, 4 couple. You following? Then Thessalonians is about the end of days. It is in Thessalonians that he talks about the coming of the Antichrist. It is in Thessalonians that people have a heresy about that the day of the Lord is almost like the Jehovah's Witness heresy, where they talk about the multiple end of times and Christ had come and had come and had come and nothing is happening. Thessalonians is about the end of times. If you want to look into places, talks about the end of times, Thessalonians, a little bit of 1 Corinthians 15 has it too, just to keep in mind, where we read it in the night of the Holy Resurrection. 1 Corinthians 15, remember that. Then we have the personal, we end up with personal letters, not to churches. So Thessalonians will end your church letters. You have the beginning with the third set of couples, which is 1st and 2nd Timothy, and then Titus, and then Philemon. Okay? These are all pastoral. It is letters to how to lead the church. Titus was a bishop. Timothy was a bishop. Philemon was a bishop, but also he had a problem with his slave. And he was writing this letter. It's a very personal letter. Out of all of them, Philemon is a very specific thing. Accept Onesimus back. Onesimus, it's a beautiful story. Onesimus was a slave of Philemon who had stole his money and ran, and then was converted by St. Paul. When St. Paul met him, he heard the story, felt bad for Onesimus, said, go back to your master, reconcile yourself to him, I'm going to write him a letter. He writes him a letter and says, if he took any money from you, I'll give it back to you. Philemon is one chapter, and that's it. That's the story. That's the shortest. So, the last 4 is the personal letters. 2 Timothy, 1 Titus, and 1 Philemon. Okay? Can we now recite the names? And this is this session. We're done. I think if you get the names of the letters this day, I'm happy. I've done my job. So the first one is the Gospel of The second one is the couple is First and Second Corinthians. It is about mainly it's the job of fixing their morality. It's where you find what happens if a man makes a big sin, to marry or not to marry. All that stuff is in the Corinthians. And then after Corinthians you have the 4 letters. Galatians, the foolish, right? Then the Ephesians with the poetry about the church. Has the 3 images, which are the body, the building, and the spouse. And then after that, Philippi, which is Philippians, which is the joyful letter. And then after that, Colossians, which is the theology about Christ. So there is contrast between Colossians and Ephesians. Ephesians is about the church, Colossians is about Christ. And then 2 Thessalonians, and the main subject there is the end of times. And then you have 1st, 2nd Timothy, Titus. 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus is about, they are all personal, but the first 3 is about leadership in the church. They are bishops. Titus, Timothy are bishops. Philemon may be also a leader, but Philemon specifically is about his slave. That's it. And you say it without looking, I'm going to cover it. Let's do this. A practice. How many letters we have?
13 plus
13 plus Hebrews. First one. Roman subject.
The Gospel.
The second and the third.
First and second.
First and second Corinthians, and it's talking mainly about addressing the problems with sexual immorality. The fourth. Galatians, it is
Polish Galatians.
about what they're Polish. They're trying to. And then number 5. Ephesians, which is poetry about the church. Number 6. Philippians, a very joyful letter. Number 7 and 7, which is a poetry about or the theology of Christ. And number 8 and 9. Thessalonians. The end of days. Number 10. Now with 10, 11, 13, 14, they're all as a group, they are personal little nutshell. Timothy 1 and 2, Titus. Timothy is the one where he says what a bishop should be like, what a deacon should be like, what a priest should be like. Titus, how you deal with the church. And then Philemon, it's about his slave. Okay? Alright, I'm going to quiz you on this. You'll have a test. By the way, if you finish all the letters, I am going to ask Abuna from the seminaries where I teach to give us certificates about the New Testament. So you'll be passing a test and you get a certificate that you have finished a New Testament course. And it will have something like this and also have something about understanding things. Like we had explained today in St. Paul's life, what are the key events and how did it play in his life. Okay, we'll stop here for 5 minutes. Or 2 minutes. Means it's sent to bishops, to pastors, to somebody who takes care of the church. We call it the pastoral epistles. That's 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. It appears that Paul was released from Roman imprisonment, recorded in Acts, because it ends, the book of Acts ends with Paul in a house imprisonment in Rome. So it appears from those letters that he was released. He continued his ministry and perhaps ventured as far as west as Spain. And that is Romans 15:24. He says to the Romans, he in the book of Acts, he ends in Rome. He doesn't visit Rome before. But in his letter to the Romans, he says, I will plan on visiting you before on my way to Spain. By the end of the 1st century, the church was well established in the eastern Mediterranean region, and there were active missions efforts to the east and the west. And that's where we have the map looked at. Letters of St. Paul. Letters were a common form of communication in the 1st century. Paul wrote them to encourage, warn, and instruct the churches he had founded. 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. He also, Colossians is the second one. He also wrote letters to churches that he had not visited, Romans and Colossians, and to individuals, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, and Philemon. Through his letters, Paul's ministry was extended not only to those directly addressed in his writing, but also to readers of the Bible throughout the centuries. There is a pattern in the letters writing, and I want to focus on this. This is something important. He always starts with a greeting. Some of the priests actually are people who are pious people in the church. They would greet you in the email by peace and grace. But you wonder, where is that coming from? It's from St. Paul. Why St. Paul choose peace and grace? Peace in the Hebrew language is shalom. Shabbat shalom. Peace of the Sabbath means we're resting. The peace of the resting. But the Greeks used to greet each other with something like grace. So when he sends his letter to a church that's mixed, what will he need to do? Greet them with the two languages, with shalom for the Hebrews and with grace for the Greeks. So that's the normal greeting. It's almost in all the letters. St. Paul's burden for addresses is revealed in his thanksgiving, in thanksgiving for the spiritual progress of his readers, like in Thessalonians, intercession sometimes in Philippians. He also, his concern, he's very concerned about some of the churches. You can feel that in his writing. In the writing of the Galatians, you can feel the heat. When I read Galatians, I feel him like he's jumping up and down when he's writing. He writes with a very strong language. And sometimes in the letter to Corinthians too, when he writes about this man who committed sexual immorality with his mother, stepmother, he was like furious. He said, as the Lord is, as he says, as my spirit with you, and the Lord is our witness, this man should be excommunicated. Was very angry. If you read carefully the letters of St. Paul, you would understand. This is the most important thing. If you read it carefully, you understand what kind of a spirit you should be. A Christian sometimes think that I should be always mellow and nice and sweet. Yes, and Jesus was. But sometimes he was a roaring lion. He can be always sweet. When something is happening wrong, you cannot just stand by and say, we have to be kind, we have to be nice, and we have to be gentle. No, not really. Okay? And so St. Paul was the same. St. Paul's letters cover both doctrinal and practical issues. Most of the time, you read the letters of St. Paul, he starts the letters with theology, deep explanations of God's Word. But the last part of it is advices and practice. There's exception. You understand, like the letter is divided into two parts. Theoretical, that's where you get theology from, and also practical. Philippians is not the same. Philippians, actually, we're going to start with next time, is mix. He gets a little bit of theology, and he tells you what to do. A little bit of theology, and a little bit, one of the most famous, let the mind of Christ be in all of you. Because he was in the form of God, and he emptied himself, you too should be humbled. Immediately. He doesn't really get too much distance between theoretical or theology and practical. Let's go into this timeline because it's important too. And if you remember the letters, now we go into the second memorizable list. This is 48 AD, and this is 68 AD and 95. The first missionary journey, the second missionary journey, so the first is between, it's almost 50 AD. The first missionary journey is 50. You see it here. The second missionary journey is between 50 and 53. The third is between 53 and 57. Then the first Roman imprisonment is 60 to 63. They think there is a fourth missionary journey in between the two imprisonments. Then he's imprisoned again before he is executed between 67 and 68. He was martyred in that year with St. Peter in the same year. And who was this, the Caesar, the emperor? Anybody knows? Nero. Nero is the one who took care of both of them. Okay, so when you try to take the letters, how many we said letters? 13 letters. And put them against the timeline, this is how it comes out. You have 1, 2, that's 3, 7, and then you have 11, and you have
14.
That's 14. There's one repeated twice here.
Galatians on that twice.
Galatians, right?
The first one.
Yeah. That's a question mark because they don't. Some people say it's here, some people say it's here. And wherever you have a question mark, it is questionable. It is not really fixed date. People debate it. Okay? So the first one to be written is Galatians, maybe. Then Thessalonians, then Corinthians, and Romans, and again these are questionable. Then Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon, Philippians, 1 Timothy, Titus, 2 Timothy. What I want you to know for sure is the letters he wrote from prison when he was tied up, which would be Ephesians,
Philippians.
Colossians, Philippians. Why Philippians is an amazing one. Remember what I said about the character of this?
Joy.
Joyful letter. Can you imagine? That's a character of St. Paul. He's always joyful whenever he is persecuted. You put him in prison, he's singing. As if he gets his joy from being persecuted for Christ. That's why he is joyful. So these are called the
Poetry.
imprisonment letter or the captive letters, where he wrote them from captivity. These four. I always thought 2 Timothy is one, but apparently in the writing it is the second imprisonment. So you can add these 5 together, but at least those 4 in the first time. Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon, and Philippians. And the most dear of them is Philippians. They're all written in the same time, but they all have a characteristic. They're actually not very angry or upset letters. There is nothing that he's angry with. And then 2 Timothy is also part of that. But you notice that all his instructive and dealing with problems is in his free missionary trips. Let's go into Philippians and then we'll end with that. Read it together. Page 4. There's no doubt this is the most joyful writing, not only of St. Paul, but even in the New Testament, for different reasons. Philippians is an epistle of joy and encouragement in the midst of adverse circumstances. As I said, you put this and plot it against his life, and it doesn't really match at all. Paul freely expressed his fond affection for the Philippian Christians, appreciates their consistent testimony and support, and lovingly urges them to center their actions and thoughts on the pursuit of the person and power of Christ. He's given to you and me in this letter the key to be happy in adversity. And the key is finding Christ. There are 4 chapters in this letter. We're going to go through them in the coming 2 or 3 times. And it's really, this is one of the letters I kind of find worth studying in detail because it gives you the focus. In a nutshell, what do you need to do with the gospel as a Christian? What should I do? And the answer in this letter actually, how to find Christ every day. How to find Him every day. That's the key. The themes. The date of writing. The traditional view has been that St. Paul wrote Philippians between AD 61 and 63. We said in his first Roman imprisonment. That's a late letter. He didn't do it when he was first converted or after he had started his missionary trips. It's in his imprisonment. Ephesians is one of the 4 in the first imprisonment, which is Philippians is one of the 4. Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon, and Philippians. The reference to the palace, it's not the palace, the place, it's the palace guard. There's a reference in the letter, we're going to look at it when we come into the details of the letter. It's in chapter 1, verse 13. There's a palace guard. It means that he was guarded. There was palace guard with him. And Caesar household in 422 fit with Paul's Roman imprisonment. In addition, St. Paul's statement in chapter 1, 12 to 20 and 422 strongly suggests that the imprisonment was fairly long. Thus, this letter appears to have been written sometime after the beginning of Paul's imprisonment recorded in Acts 28. It immediately written after that chapter, the timeline of that chapter in Acts. Themes. Philippians is one of St. Paul's most personal letters. He speaks about himself in the most personal way, and it's very close to him. Another thing I want to tell you about this letter too, you come very close to St. Paul. This is very important, that the saints, when you come closer to a saint, you're coming closer to Christ, because they have the same mind. He says, imitate me as I'm imitating Christ. You come closer to him, you're actually meeting Christ through that very close disciple of his. That's why people used to love to congregate, to get gathered around people who had close relationship with our Lord. So it's one of the most personal letters. It shares his own experience with Christ and his struggle over whether to prefer dying to be with Christ or living to serve the Philippians. This is what you have. I have this struggle. I wish to die. To me, it's better to go to be with Christ. But I thought about it. Maybe it's expedient that I stay with you because you need me. The Philippians were in his heart, and they supported him in his imprisonment in chapter 1, verse 7. A fact which explains the note of gratitude that St. Paul frequently sounds in many verses. They helped him a lot in Philippians. And that's why when we come next time, I'm going to read with you his first experience in Philippi. You know, that he had this prison experience in Philippi. We're going to read this from the book of Acts next time. Philippians focuses on St. Paul's account of his prison circumstances, St. Paul's appeal to have the mind of Christ, his appeal to have the knowledge of Christ, and his appeal to have the peace of Christ. These are 3 chapters. So the first chapter is his circumstances, what's going on with him, and that's our beginning of the study. What's going on with me, what's happening in my life today, that's what he's writing to them from Rome. Second, he is encouraging them and pushing them and actually begging them to have the mind of Christ. And just to give you a note ahead, what is the mind of Christ that he wants to talk about? One word: humility. The mind of Christ is summarized in this word: humility, to be humble. And the second one in the second chapter is the knowledge of Christ. And that knowledge is not mind knowledge. We're not going to memorize things about Christ. We're not going to sit and write a thesis about him. The knowledge here is the gnosis, the experience. You read in the book of Genesis, and Adam knew his wife. Well, he didn't know her before. He knew her name. He's the one who named her, right? What is that about? He had a very intimate experience of that person. So this is what we talk about. The knowledge of Christ here is an experience of Christ that we have to have every day. And he has the appeal to have the peace of Christ, and the peace that is bringing on joy, which is a peace that surpasses all knowledge. Prominent in Philippians in the theme of joy. The word joy, which is Greek for chara, joy, chara, is found 5 times. And the verb to rejoice occurs 11 times. You will not find that word repeated that many times in any other place in the New Testament. And once in these verses 2:28, 3:1, and 4:10, despite his unpleasant circumstances in prison, St. Paul manifests a joyous confidence in God's provision for him personally and for the Philippian Christians. St. Paul exhorts the Philippians to have a spirit of unity. That's another one. He actually talks about the joy and unity and mutual concern by embracing the attitude of humility. Unity is built on humility, not on any kind of policy. You know, people try to make unity through organizing things and making rules for everybody. You know, you hear about the trend of independence, then interdependence. That creates unity. You know, you hear that? These terms, Like when we were children, we were dependent on our parents. That created unity. I need my parents and my parents need me. So we are one because of the need. Then I don't need my parents at teenage. I am independent. Now we don't have the unity. It's gone. But then you go back into interdependence in marriage. I need my wife, but also she needs me. And that creates that. But the unity that he's talking about is none of the above. It is something that comes from humility by putting ourselves as servants for others, because our unity comes from the image and the example of Christ, that he given us the spirit of humility. He says, learn from me, from my humble, meek and humble at heart. The attitude of humility, the greatest example of which is the incarnation, crucifixion of Christ. And there's a key word there that actually we're going to stop and examine for some time. It's called the kenosis. That's Greek word. And it's the most difficult, one of the most difficult terms in theology of the New Testament. And we're going to spend some time with it. To empty oneself. Kenosis. Kenosis. These good Greek words to keep in mind as you study and look them up and understand different meanings of them. Kenosis, or self-emptying of Christ, which does not mean that he relinquished his essential divinity, but he withheld his pre-incarnate glory and voluntarily restricted his use of certain attributes. To empty oneself, we'll speak about it in details, but it doesn't mean that he had given up being a God. That's not true. But he had abandoned the manifestation of his divinity. It's almost like I have a rich person who has $3 trillion, but then he goes to eat in McDonald's with his friends, and he would accept to share the expense. It doesn't mean that he's not rich, but he had relinquished, give up the prestige, and he accepted to be in the standard of his friends, which to him is a big loss, but it's not. It's a great gain for his friends. Now, at the end line is in page 4-5. So chapter 1, simply St. Paul, present circumstance, affliction for Christ. Chapter 2, have the mind of Christ, and which is humility. Chapter 3 is the knowledge of Christ against living for the flesh. And chapter 4, the peace of Christ, which is with God and with each other. Okay, I can take any questions you have. Thank you. Let's pray. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and God, amen. Make us worthy, O Lord, to say thankfully, our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Christ Jesus our Lord, thine is the kingdom, power, and glory. May the love of God the Father and riches and the Son Jesus Christ and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with you. Be with peace, be with you. Next time will be a test before you start.